standing with us.
The British government has just done the unthinkable. It has pushed aside 1.33 million citizens waiting for social housing and moved to prioritise illegal migrants for brand new council homes. There was no warning, no national debate, no attempt to justify why those who have contributed nothing to Britain should leap ahead of those who have waited years. The announcement landed like a political explosion, not whispered, not disguised, but presented as policy, and the nation erupted. The question now gripping the nation is brutally simple. How did we get here?
In Ashfield alone, we've got about 7,000 people on the council house waiting list. It's been like that for many, many years. And to suggest that asylum seekers, and let's be honest, a lot of these aren't genuine asylum seekers, they're illegal migrants crossing the channel and getting loads and loads of freebies in our countries. To suggest, though, that these are going to go to the top of the queue above the residents, the born and bred Ashfield residents in my constituency, is absolutely disgusting.
It began with an unassuming policy update pushed out of Whitehall. 5 local authorities had volunteered for a new pilot scheme to house asylum seekers directly in council homes. The stated aim was to reduce the reliance on hotels. But within minutes of the announcement, the political temperature shifted. In Ashfield, in Brighton, in Hackney, in Peterborough, and deep into rural Wales, councillors were blindsided. Emails, messages and calls flooded in, each one sharpened by disbelief. Reform MP Lee Anderson gave voice to what millions were already thinking when he labelled the plan disgusting. His district alone has 7,000 residents waiting for housing, many for years. Veterans, pensioners, disabled residents, young families hanging on with rising rents, all facing the prospect of being overtaken by individuals who arrived illegally by boat. And the shockwaves didn't stop there. A councillor in Powys revealed her area had nearly 4,000 people waiting on the social housing list, some for almost 3 years, yet no one had been told that newly built homes might bypass them entirely. In communities where local surgeries have shut down, where schools are closing, and where there is no general hospital, the idea of adding more demand to a collapsing system feels like lighting a match beside dry grass. The backlash was immediate and unfiltered. Keir Starmer's government, already weakened by plummeting approval ratings, watched as frustration turned into fury. Social media erupted, local forums exploded, radio phone-ins became battlegrounds of anger as callers questioned how their own government could justify such a move. People in London expressed disbelief that asylum seekers were being placed in accommodation the average resident cannot even dream of affording. Others pointed to Glasgow, already labelled Europe's asylum seeker capital, warning that this policy could turn their towns into the next hotspot. One councillor bluntly warned that people smugglers would now advertise Britain as the land where a free house awaits you. This is political TNT, landing just months before the May local elections, and every opposition strategist knows the line that will appear on leaflets: vote Labour, lose your council home. To understand the scale of the outrage, you must understand the state of the country. Britain is already gripped by a housing emergency. NHS waiting lists have ballooned, homelessness is rising sharply, and immigration remains one of the most divisive issues in the national debate. Anti-immigration protests spread across the UK through 2025, fueled by the sense that the system is not only overwhelmed, but fundamentally unfair. Despite repeated promises to restore order and take control, the government has struggled to contain small boat crossings. Costs for migrant hotels continue to escalate. Enforcement bodies are stretched to capacity. And while ministers emphasise new asylum reforms, Britons feel they are witnessing a government drifting rather than governing. This is the context in which the council housing announcement landed. Not in a moment of stability, but in a moment where every fracture is already visible.
The consequences for the government could be seismic. Starmer's promise of grown-up politics now rings hollow for many voters who believe the system favours those arriving illegally over those who have contributed to the country for generations. Local councils feel abandoned, communities feel unheard, And even moderate voices warn that dispersing asylum seekers across council homes will make oversight extremely difficult. Hotels, for all their flaws, kept people in one place. Council homes scatter them across towns and estates, making monitoring nearly impossible. This is not just a housing policy, it is a security vulnerability, and it is a political liability of extraordinary scale.
Britain's political calendar is unforgiving. Local elections are only months away. Every party now sees an opportunity or a threat. For the government, this is a nightmare that will follow them everywhere, every doorstep, every debate, every interview. For their opponents, it is a perfect storm. A government struggling with borders, failing on housing, and now pushing a policy that places asylum seekers ahead of citizens. The narrative almost writes itself. A government out of touch, prioritising outsiders over its own electorate, and destabilising already fragile communities. It is the kind of story that cuts across class, region, and ideology. Everyone knows someone on a housing list. Everyone feels the pressure on public services. Everyone senses the imbalance. This is why the anger will not fade, because people are not simply reacting to a policy, they are reacting to a pattern. This crisis exposes a deeper reality. Britain has been heading towards this moment for years. Housing shortages, slow asylum processing, and years of underinvestment created the perfect storm, and this policy is simply where it all erupts. The backlash isn't just about migrants getting homes, it's about communities already stripped of services now being asked to absorb even more pressure. In places that have lost hospitals, GP access, youth centres and public travel, the message feels brutally clear. Their needs remain secondary. That sense of abandonment is what turns frustration into political anger. The government argues the plan saves money compared to hotels, but that misses the point. Housing is emotional terrain, stability, fairness, belonging. When people waiting years see newcomers appear to jump the queue, no amount of fiscal logic can override the feeling of injustice. And that is the real danger. The government treated a housing crisis as a bureaucratic issue, when it is actually a cultural and political fault line. This isn't just one bad decision. It taps into a deeper belief that the system no longer works for ordinary Britons. That is why the reaction is so fierce. It's not about a pilot scheme. It's about trust and who the state chooses to stand with.
The country stands in disbelief and rising anxiety. A government insists it is acting responsibly. Millions insist they have been pushed aside. And somewhere between those two positions lies the truth of a nation wrestling with fairness, identity, and trust. This story will not quietly disappear. It will define the coming months. It may define the next election. And the question echoing across the country is the one the government cannot escape. If this is what fairness looks like, what happens next?
Come on, you pervert! Listen, mate, we're not here to cause a problem, yeah? We just want a word with you. Open the door, mate. We want to know if you want this why that girl at the age of 14 was groomed. And you guys, every single one of you that are living here, is allowing this to go ahead under your nose.
There is a painful reality in Britain today that the authorities are desperate to keep under a lid. While the politicians in London talk about safeguarding and progress, a Bristol courtroom just provided a gut-wrenching reality check. This isn't an isolated case in the north. It is a nationwide scourge that has reached Somerset, London, and every corner of our country. But the real story today isn't just the crime, it's the abandonment of the survivors. While the Home Office has quietly blasted £19 million of your tax money to Pakistan to deal with their child abuse crisis, 250,000 survivors right here in Britain are being told to fade into the background. Keir Starmer has time for high-profile photo ops, but for the survivors of our own country's organised abuse networks, he hasn't found 5 minutes. Today, we expose the shadow effect and the moment the UK's social contract was officially shredded. Let's look at the data that Whitehall hopes you don't connect. The government recently authorised a £19 million package to Pakistan to address child sex exploitation. While we all hope for justice for children globally, the survivors in the UK are asking a devastating question. Why can't our own country sort its own children first? Survivor Ellie Reynolds, a woman of incredible courage, recently resigned from the government's own panel in protest. She isn't asking for a handout, she's asking for a listening ear and a support system that works. Instead, she and her colleagues have been met with half-hearted letters and zero commitment from the Prime Minister. Even more shocking is the role of the Safeguarding Minister, Jess Phillips. Reports suggest she has cancelled meetings with survivors for over a year. When those meant to protect you won't even look you in the eye, you aren't just a victim of a crime, you are a victim of the state.
Why the wall of silence? Ellie calls it the shadow effect. The government was forced into a public inquiry by the Louise Casey Review, but survivors say the authorities are now trying to kick the can down the road. They are attempting to widen the remit of the inquiry, specifically to avoid pointing the finger at the identified demographic responsible for these crimes, specifically Muslim men of Pakistani heritage. By diluting the facts, the government is ensuring the problem remains unsolvable. They would rather see 250,000 British survivors fade than risk a difficult conversation about cultural integration and law enforcement failure. This isn't an administrative error, it is a systemic choice to prioritise political optics over the safety of our daughters. The government thinks that by sending money abroad and ignoring the roars of survivors at home, the headlines will eventually go away. They are wrong. You cannot charity wash the betrayal of an entire generation of girls. To the viewers who stayed, you see the disparity. You see the £19 million exit the country, while the Safeguarding Minister exits the room. My promise to you is to keep amplifying the voices of survivors like Ellie Reynolds, whom the authorities would rather silence. We confirm that the shadows are being lifted, and we sharply shot the truth. A state that refuses to protect its own children has forfeited its right to lead.
The room fell silent the moment the question was asked. No headlines, no slogans, no political choreography, just a blunt demand echoing across the committee floor. When will the migrant hotels finally close? Within seconds, the tension tightened, and for the first time in months, the Prime Minister found himself cornered. What followed was not just another parliamentary exchange, but a collision between a government under pressure and a system buckling under its own weight. This was the clearest glimpse yet into the immigration firestorm, now engulfing Britain. A crisis of overcrowded hotels, anxious communities and policies struggling to keep pace with reality. And one unsettling question is now gripping Westminster. Has Keir Starmer lost control of Britain's borders?
We do want, asylum hotels were at their height measured, I think it was 400 or so. They're down to about 200 now. I'm absolutely determined that we will close them by the end of this Parliament, sooner if it's possible, and that's why military sites are under consideration.
Can you understand the how local residents feel and the uncertainty there is? They've been told that they've been identified as a site. They don't know when it's going to open. They don't know what the clientele are going to be, and there is real concern. And the MPs that represent those areas have made representations to me as chair of the Select Committee. But we really need to understand how this is going to affect local areas. Can you sympathise with that?
I do understand that.
It began with what sounded like an ordinary inquiry into accommodation planning, but it escalated with remarkable speed. MPs pressed the Prime Minister to explain why hundreds of asylum seekers remained in hotels despite repeated promises to shut them, and why military sites in Catterick, Crowborough and Inverness were being prepared quietly in the background. The committee chair pushed harder, warning that local residents had been briefed without receiving any timelines, impact assessments or even basic information. Many felt blindsided and abandoned. Starmer attempted to calm the room, repeating his pledge that the government wants to close them by the end of this Parliament. Yet as he spoke, it became painfully clear that this was no longer a question of policy, but of credibility. Communities are living with uncertainty, MPs said, and the government could not keep hiding behind vague assurances. When Starmer insisted that he had inherited record levels of claims and that the system was finally being repaired, the room did not soften. Instead, the exchange exposed a reality the government has tried hard to downplay. the sense that Britain's asylum system has drifted dangerously close to breaking point, while ministers scramble to regain control. Outside the walls of Parliament, the numbers paint an even sharper picture. More than 41,000 people arrived by small boat last year, one of the highest totals ever recorded, and a 13% increase from the year before. The promise to stop the boats now rings hollow to many voters who feel the crisis is worsening rather than stabilising. Hotels, which were supposed to be an emergency measure, remain packed. Attempts to phase them out have been overwhelmed by the continuing rise in arrivals and the slow processing of claims. And now the public is being told that military bases may need to be converted into holding centres, a move that has sparked controversy from Kent to Scotland. There is also the issue of new border enforcement powers, such as the authority to seize and inspect migrants' mobile phones. This measure, designed to dismantle smuggling networks and verify identities, has triggered a fierce backlash from human rights groups, who warn that Britain is sliding into a climate of surveillance anxiety. For a government elected on the promise of competence and control, these developments cut deep. They reinforce the perception of a state constantly reacting, never anticipating, and struggling to translate its pledges into results. Across the UK, the emotional temperature is rising. Residents in coastal towns and inland communities alike say they feel left in the dark, unsure when or how new arrivals will be placed in their area. Many emphasise that their frustration is not directed at the migrants themselves, but at what they describe as an atmosphere of disorder. They want clarity, transparency, and planning, not sudden announcements delivered after decisions have already been made. This sense of neglect has reignited tensions that erupted during the anti-immigration protests of 2025. Some demonstrations were peaceful, others turned hostile, forcing police to brace for new flashpoints. Councillors report that public meetings have become increasingly heated, with tempers fraying and fears spreading quickly online. At the political level, the pressure is intensifying. Reform UK is capitalising on public anger, presenting Labour as weak on borders. The Conservatives accuse Starmer of hiding behind bureaucratic defences. Even Labour supporters privately acknowledge that the government is wobbling on one of the issues voters care most deeply about. All of these undercurrents were on display during the committee confrontation. The MP's scepticism, the Prime Minister's strained responses, and the atmosphere of restrained frustration reflected a country on edge, a nation that feels its asylum system has drifted beyond its control. Starmer's defence rests on a single line, that the last government left behind a broken system, and Labour is now fixing it. He argues that claim processing is improving, and that the hotel numbers will drop as reforms take hold. Yet outside the committee room, the public is growing impatient. People want to see arrivals fall, hotels close, and a sense of order restored. Instead, they see a system still pushed to capacity. Military bases quietly prepared in the background and legal battles gathering pace over Britain's obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. Trust is eroding, and each fresh surge of arrivals deepens the impression that the government is responding to events rather than shaping them. In this context, the committee clash felt like a moment of reckoning. It forced Starmer to defend not just his policies but his authority. It also raised a deeper concern that no minister could brush aside whether Britain's borders are being governed by strategy or by crisis management. As the hearing drew to a close, Starmer attempted to reclaim the narrative by insisting that the priority must be reducing claim numbers, so that hotels and temporary sites become unnecessary. But the looks exchanged among MPs suggested little confidence that the government could deliver on that promise. When the Prime Minister left the room, questions lingered in the air, not only inside Westminster, but across the country. If Labour cannot bring this system under control, what comes next? And how long before the tension spilling out in committee rooms begins to spill onto Britain's streets? Britain is standing at a knife edge. The migrant hotel scandal, far from fading, is becoming a symbol of a deeper, more structural crisis. And the most unsettling question remains unanswered. How close is Britain to a full-scale border breakdown? And what happens if the system finally gives way?